time of year. Everybody wants to talk about the North Pole, but I feel
Sure.
like people don't know that much about it. So can you tell me,
Yeah.
first of all, where is the North Pole and does that change?
So the geographic North Pole is at 90 degrees north. So it's basically the top of the world. It's the point uh, at which the Earth spins around, rotates around. And of course, up is kind of arbitrary. So when I say up, it's relative to our standard definitions. Southern Hemisphere folks might think a little differently, but it's basically as we say it, the top of the world.
And there's the geographical North Pole, but there's also a magnetic North Pole.
So the magnetic pole is where your compass points to. It's basically where the magnetic flow is, and it doesn't line up exactly with the geographic North Pole where the Earth rotates around. So there's a little bit different. So if you were wanting to go to the geographic North Pole, you don't want to use a compass because you won't actually end up there. You'd be a little bit off from there.
What's a little bit off? How far are we talking?
Well, it depends. The magnetic North Pole varies, and it moves around. So it depends, when and where you're at. It's a few hundred miles, I think, south at the moment. Well, obviously south, but kind of in the Canadian islands up towards Greenland is where it currently is. So you end up a few hundred miles off from the geographic North Pole if you followed your compass.
Interesting. All right, so let's talk about the spot where the geographic North Pole is. Is there any actual land there?
No, there's no land. It's just an ocean. It's an ice-covered ocean. So what you would find there is what we call sea ice, the ice floating on the ocean, the ice that forms from freezing of the salty ocean waters. So you would probably be able to stand on the North Pole, although the ice cracks and you get open water. That happens from time to time, even in wintertime. So you could have open water at the North Pole, but more than likely you would have ice there, and even in summer, the ice still stays there. At least at the moment, the ice has been decreasing up in the Arctic, but the North Pole has still remained, by and large, ice covered. So it's interesting. Santa has to do a little bit of magic to live up at the North Pole. You can't build a house there, because the other thing is the ice drifts with the winds and the currents. So even if you stand at the North Pole, you won't be standing at the North Pole for very long because the winds and the currents are going to pull that ice away from the North Pole. So you don't stay in one place very long at the North Pole unless you're like Santa that can do that.
It is magic. All right, so let's say you are standing at the North Pole. What kind of interesting phenomenon might you experience there?
Well, it depends on the time of year. I mean, right now it's winter. It's 24 hours of darkness. So you're just going to see a lot of darkness. The ice cover is pretty remarkable up there. You probably hear crunching of the ice as it moves around. It will crunch in to each other. Tends to be very dry this time of year, especially, so very crisp air. You'd see a lot of stars, because it's very clear air. If it is clear, I mean, it can be cloudy up there a lot, but in winter it often is clear. One thing that you won't see at the North Pole, that people may think about is the aurora, the northern lights. Yeah, we think of those as happening up north, and they do, but it happens actually in a ring around the North Pole. So at the North Pole, you don't generally see the northern lights. It's farther south, places like Alaska or like Norway, that you'll see the northern lights. So you don't go to the North Pole to see the northern lights. During the summertime, of course, you get interesting things. The sun is out 24 hours, from the start of spring to the start of fall. And so you don't see the sun set, and the sun doesn't move really from east to west. It will circle around you. If you stood there, you just see it circling around you. And so that's kind of an interesting thing. You also get very interesting sun effects in the summertime, or you can get little ice crystals in the atmosphere that reflect the sunlight, and you get things like what are called sundogs, which are little effects or sun pillars around the sun. You can get halos. You can even get like little mini rainbows if it reflects the light in a certain way. So you'll get not like a full rainbow, but like little strips of a spectrum of light. So you can see lots of neat things during the summer. In the winter, not quite as much, but it would still be a pretty interesting place to be, I think.
Yeah, what about weather systems? Are there any? Can weather systems even operate at the North Pole?
Oh yes, they do. You get into the ice kind of dampens weather systems. So you get a lot of cyclones, even what we call sometimes mini hurricanes. Pretty strong winds, pretty powerful, not near as big as like your tropical hurricanes, but you have really strong winds. But those come in from the sides and really happen because you have this cold air from the ice cover mixing with the warm, moist air from like the Atlantic or the Pacific, that's ice free. But what typically happens is those will come in and they'll dissipate because they lose their energy, as they don't have any moisture and there's not heat from the ocean. So it tends to be a pretty calm place, especially in the winter. You still get you can still get some systems moving through, more so in the summer when things are more active and there's more energy. But it still snows. It oftentimes is very fine, kind of crunchy snow that you get when it's really cold, what we call diamond dust, which is kind of precipitates right out of midair almost. So it falls down. So it's not as active as what you see, where we live in the winter time, but you still get weather up there. Yeah.
Have you been to either one of the poles?
I have not. I've been up in the Arctic a few times. I've been up in an aircraft where we did some experiments. We got to about 82 degrees north, which is a few hundred miles from the pole, but not quite there. But I work with a lot of colleagues that have been up to or near the pole. The South Pole is a lot more visited because that's on land, and the U.S. has a station there, and so people usually work there, and especially in the summertime. But people even winter over there. The North Pole, like I said, is shifted. You can't really put a station there. The Russians used to have what they call drifting stations that they would put up near the pole. Of course, they drift away pretty quickly, so they wouldn't be at the pole for very long. There was a big international expedition just a couple of years ago that froze in a ship that drifted across the Arctic from Siberia across to the Atlantic towards Greenland, and it drifted through the wintertime. They didn't actually get to the pole. It drifted a little bit south of the pole, although they did kind of come out and then sail back in the summertime and cruised up. It's an icebreaker getting through the ice and went to the pole briefly. So that's typically how people get to the pole, is with icebreakers to go up, and either for research or they even have some tourist ships that sometimes go up there, generally Russian tourist ships that will go up there, and then also submarines. The Navy, the U.S. Navy and British Navy and probably the Russian Navy as well, will cruise up under the ice and then break through at the North Pole. So folks have done that, but it's pretty rare to actually have people at the North Pole, other than Santa, of course.
Yeah, of course. It's wild to think about though, like time and days and kind of jumping around and how time zones, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
All
All the
right.
time zones come together at the North Pole, so you're kind of all times at once in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you take a few feet one direction or another, and it's all over the place. What about narwhals? Are there any narwhals?
It's probably a little far north for narwhals, because they do need to breathe and come up through the air. It's possible we might see some up there because, like I said, the ice cracks and you get leads. More so during summer, probably, because in the winter, those what we call leads, those open water areas, start freezing over pretty quickly, so they don't last for very long. But in the summer, you might see some of those up there, but they're more south towards like the coast of Canada and Alaska. Yeah, there's not a lot of animals up there. You're a long way from land, but there are occasionally polar bears that can be found. They will roam up that way. It's not too far from the northern tip of Greenland, and the bears live on the ice. And cracks in the ice, seals may be up there. So it's not completely lifeless, but it's pretty deserted, except for Santa's workshop, of course. So.